There were Too Many Girls with Desi Arnaz and Eddie Bracken, and Pal Joey with Gene Kelly and June Havoc, Vivian Siegel. And there were two guys hoofing in the line next to.
Behind Hollywood's golden smiles and studio-made romances, Van Johnson lived a carefully guarded double life, and he wasn't alone. Known to the world as America's clean-cut sweetheart, Johnson quietly moved through old Hollywood's hidden social circles, dating in secret and knowing the true identities of actors the studios worked hard to conceal. Long before conversations about sexuality were safe, Van Johnson knew the names, the risks, and the silence that defined an entire era. Born Charles Vanell Johnson on August 25, 1916 in Newport, Rhode Island, he rose from humble beginnings to become one of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's biggest box office stars. At a time when America was searching for comfort and reassurance, Johnson symbolized youthful optimism, warmth, and emotional sincerity, exactly what audiences needed during uncertain years. But behind the glowing screen image was a man shaped by loss, resilience, and quiet courage. After his father's death, Johnson was raised largely by his mother, Loretta Snyder, who encouraged his early interest in performance. As a teenager, he found refuge in theater and music, discovering a passion for acting that would define his life. Determined to succeed, he moved to New York City to chase Broadway dreams, enduring long hours, financial struggle, and unglamorous chorus roles. Those years were tough, uncertain, and far from the stardom that awaited him, but they forged his discipline and resolve. Hollywood eventually took notice. Signed by MGM, Johnson starred in small parts before breaking through during World War II. His boy-next-door looks and gentle sincerity struck a powerful chord with audiences. Unlike the hardened heroes of other eras, Van Johnson played soldiers as real people, vulnerable, kind, and emotionally open, men shaped by fear, friendship, sacrifice, and love. On-screen, he gave America hope. Off-screen, he carried secrets that reflected both the beauty and the cost of Hollywood's golden age. In 1943, at the very peak of his rising stardom, Van Johnson came terrifyingly close to losing everything. During the filming of A Guy Named Joe, a massive camera crane suddenly fell, slamming into his head and leaving him with life-threatening injuries. Doctors weren't sure he would survive, and for weeks, Hollywood quietly prepared for the worst. The recovery that followed was brutal and uncertain, marked by pain, fear, and months away from the spotlight. The accident left Johnson permanently changed. Metal plates were implanted in his skull, and the scars never fully faded. Yet instead of ending his career, the tragedy reshaped it. When he finally returned to the screen, audiences sensed something new, an emotional depth, a vulnerability, and a quiet sensitivity that hadn't been there before. Far from turning away, the public embraced him even more, feeling as though they had survived the ordeal alongside him. By the mid to late 1940s, Van Johnson had reached the height of his fame. Films like 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, Battleground, The Caine Mutiny, and In the Good Old Summertime proved his remarkable range as he moved effortlessly between war dramas, romantic comedies, and musicals. He often portrayed men defined by loyalty, moral strength, and emotional honesty, qualities that mirrored the image audiences had come to trust. Van Johnson felt safe, familiar, almost like a brother or close friend, and that sense of trust fueled his enduring popularity. But behind the warm smile and wholesome screen presence was a far more complicated reality. Johnson guarded his private life fiercely, quietly battling the pressures of fame, rigid studio control, and the unspoken limits placed on personal expression in mid-century Hollywood. Struggles the audience never saw, even as they adored him. Behind Hollywood's flawless smiles and carefully staged fairy tales, Van Johnson was quietly fighting battles no one was allowed to see. The rigid studio system demanded perfection, leaving no room for vulnerability or individuality. Johnson learned to survive in silence, maintaining professionalism while wrestling with emotional isolation and lingering health problems from his near-fatal accident. As Hollywood shifted through the 1950s and 1960s, his box office dominance slowly faded, but his devotion to acting never did. He kept working on film, on television, and on stage, appearing on Broadway and in touring productions, refusing to let relevance define his worth. In later years, fans rediscovered him, drawn not just to his legacy, but to the quiet dignity with which he aged. His performances grew more reflective, shaped by hardship, experience, and a lifetime spent watching fame rise and fall. Amid this carefully controlled world, Van Johnson's marriage to former stage actress Eve Abbott on January 25, 1947, unfolded like a story written by the studios themselves. It was the height of Hollywood's golden age, when contracts governed not only careers but personal lives. At the time, Johnson was one of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's most valuable stars. Audiences adored him for his wholesome, all-American charm, his easy smile, his boy-next-door appeal. MGM had invested heavily in that image, and the wedding was promoted as a fairy tale ending. To the public, it confirmed everything they believed about Van Johnson, the perfect romantic lead, finally settling into domestic bliss at the peak of his fame. Eve Abbott, poised and intelligent, understood the pressures of show business. Their marriage brought one child, a daughter named Skylar, who became the true emotional center of Johnson's life, offering him something Hollywood never could, a sense of grounding beyond the spotlight. To the public, Van Johnson wore the easy smile of Hollywood's golden boy, but at home, his most meaningful role was far from the spotlight. By many accounts, Van was a devoted and deeply protective father, especially toward his daughter Skylar. Friends and colleagues later recalled that no matter how complicated his marriage became, his love for her never wavered. In an industry famous for distant, career-obsessed fathers, Johnson stood apart, making a point to be present, affectionate, and proud of his role as a dad. Through his marriage to Eve Abbott, Johnson also stepped into the role of stepfather to her two sons, Edmund Keenan and Tracy Keenan Wynn. Tracy, in particular, would later find success as a screenwriter, contributing to films like The Longest Yard. For Van, this expanded family life reinforced his carefully maintained image as a family man, an identity he appeared to take seriously. Behind closed doors, however, the reality was more complicated. Blending families under the relentless glare of Hollywood attention was never easy. And while Johnson reportedly made genuine efforts to be supportive and involved, the strain slowly took its toll. Personal tensions and professional pressures began to crack the polished surface the public saw. By 1961, Van Johnson and Eve Abbott quietly separated, marking the slow unraveling of a marriage that had lasted more than a decade. A divorce did not immediately follow, shaped by the social expectations of the time and the complexities of their situation. It would take another 7 years until 1968 for the marriage to be formally dissolved. By then, Johnson's star had faded from its peak, and the once rigid studio system that had controlled his life was collapsing, allowing for slightly more openness about personal realities. In the years after their separation and eventual divorce, Eve Abbott would make statements that recast their marriage in a far more complicated and far less idyllic light. Hollywood sold Van Johnson as the perfect all-American heartthrob, but behind the smile was a secret the studio could never afford to let slip. According to Eve, Johnson's wife, their marriage was never about love. She later claimed it was a carefully arranged lavender marriage, orchestrated by MGM to silence rumors that Johnson was gay. In mid-20th century Hollywood, even a whisper of homosexuality could end a career overnight, and studios did whatever it took to protect their most valuable stars. At the time, such arrangements were disturbingly common. Powerful studios controlled every aspect of an actor's life, encouraging marriages that would reassure the public and preserve box office appeal. For years, Van Johnson was marketed as the embodiment of wholesome American masculinity, boyish smile, red hair, easy charm. MGM built him into the ideal romantic leading man, and audiences bought the illusion completely. But behind that carefully constructed image was a far more complicated reality. In later years, Johnson quietly hinted that his private life had been shaped by secrecy, coded relationships, and silent defiance of Hollywood's rigid moral rules. In rare, private conversations late in life, he reportedly acknowledged having romantic relationships with other men during the golden age of cinema. Relationships lived under constant fear of exposure and studio surveillance. He even named fellow actors he had dated while navigating that hidden world. "I didn't have the luxury of being honest," one Johnson admitted. In those days, honesty could destroy everything you worked for. Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s was ruled by strict morality clauses, where homosexuality was considered dangerous, scandalous, and absolutely career-ending. For stars under contract, being openly gay was simply not an option. Johnson understood this better than most. At the height of his fame, he was one of MGM's most valuable assets, and the studio closely monitored his friendships, public appearances, and personal relationships. Among the men he reportedly mentioned was Montgomery Clift, another MGM star whose sensitive on-screen persona concealed deep private struggles of his own. Behind the bright lights and flawless publicity photos of classic Hollywood, Van Johnson's life was a careful balancing act, one where survival often meant silence. Behind the polished smiles and carefully staged romances of classic Hollywood lived a hidden world few ever dared to name. According to accounts attributed to Van Johnson, he shared a quiet, emotionally charged relationship with another man, one that existed entirely beyond public view. Monty was different, Van Johnson allegedly said. He felt everything deeply, and that made him dangerous to himself and irresistible to others. Biographers later suggested their bond was rooted not in spectacle, but in mutual understanding. Both men were trapped by expectations they could never fully satisfy, bound by rules written by studios rather than their own hearts. Johnson also reportedly spoke about Tab Hunter, the fresh-faced star of the 1950s, who would later confirm his homosexuality. Though Hunter eventually lived openly later in life, his early career was tightly controlled by studio-arranged romances designed to project a safe heterosexual image. Tab was sweet, scared, and very young, Johnson is said to have remarked. "We were all pretending, but he hated pretending the most. If any connection existed between them, it would have been brief and carefully concealed, shaped more by fear than freedom." Another name often linked to Johnson in historical speculation is Rock Hudson, the most iconic symbol of Hollywood's enforced secrecy. While no definitive evidence points to a romantic relationship between them, Johnson reportedly acknowledged that many actors in his circle lived parallel hidden lives. "Rock understood the rules better than anyone," he allegedly said. "You smiled, you dated who they told you to date, and you never slipped." Whether friends, confidants, or something deeper, Johnson and Hudson were part of an unspoken fraternity bound by silence. These relationships, Johnson emphasized, were not casual indulgences, but emotional lifelines in an industry built on denial. "We weren't sneaking around for thrills, we were trying to survive without losing ourselves completely." Secrecy became second nature, meetings arranged through trusted intermediaries, conversations confined to private homes, and the constant fear of exposure always hanging overhead. His 1947 marriage to Eve Abbott has long been cited as part of MGM's image management strategy, a practice Johnson himself later acknowledged. "Some people married for love, others married for protection." The truth came late, but when it did, it was stripped of scandal and filled with clarity. In his final years, Van Johnson seemed far less concerned with rumors than with honesty. "I don't regret the love, I regret the fear." For him, the real tragedy wasn't what happened in secret, but why it had to stay that way. He believed the public deserved to know how many lives were quietly shaped and limited by Hollywood's unforgiving rules. Today, Johnson's legacy is viewed through a wider, more compassionate lens. His life reminds us that behind the polished smiles of old Hollywood were real people forced to divide themselves just to survive. By gently acknowledging the men he loved in silence, Johnson reclaimed a part of his identity long denied by the era that made him famous. "We were there," he said simply. "We just weren't allowed to be seen." By the early 1990s, after decades on screen and leaving an enduring mark on Hollywood's golden age, Van Johnson stepped away from the spotlight for good. Having given so much of himself to the industry, he chose a quieter ending, living his remaining years in privacy, far from the cameras and studio machines that once controlled his world. He didn't fade away under Hollywood lights. He chose to disappear into something far quieter. Van Johnson settled into a penthouse at 405 East 54th Street on Manhattan's East Side, a home that mirrored both the elegance and isolation of a man who had spent decades living in the public eye. Trading studio backlots for the steady pulse of New York City, he embraced a life of calm routines and familiar surroundings, content to let memories replace applause. As the years passed and his health began to fail, Johnson moved to Tappan Zee Manor, an assisted living facility in Nyack, New York, where he received the care he needed. Even then, he carried himself with quiet dignity. To those around him, he was gentle and gracious, a legendary figure whose enormous past contrasted softly with his modest, unassuming daily life. On December 12, 2008, Van Johnson died at the age of 92, closing the final chapter of a life that spanned and helped shape nearly a century of entertainment history. He was cremated, a simple farewell for a man who once stood among Hollywood's brightest stars, remembered not just for his fame, but as a living symbol of a vanished era that still echoes today.